نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. So we'll be looking into Umme Salma's life story, whose life is filled with faith, resilience, patience, and wisdom. She was from one of the earliest converts to accept Islam and then the last surviving wife of Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So her birth, her name was Hind bin Abi Umayyah. The reason her name was called as Umme Salma, which we usually refer as Umme Salma, because her famous son was there whose name was Salma. That's the reason she was called Umme Salma, which means mother of Salma. Okay, and she was from one of the noble tribe of Quraysh, which was known as Banu Makhzum clan, which was a very powerful tribe, you can say. Her birthplace was approximately 28 years before Hijrah, which means Hijrah to Medina 28 years before, around 589 to 597. So her first marriage was to her cousin Abu Salma, whose actual name was Abdullah ibn Abd al-Asad. The reason he was also called as Abu Salma, which was known as father of Salma. He was also called as father of Salma. Okay. For Islamic public face, sometimes between the 600s to 610 CE, they were married and they lived together in Makkah. And early conversion to Islam. So they were one of the earliest converts, Salma and her husband Abu Salma. They were almost one from one of the earliest people who converted to Islam, and then they converted to Islam during a time when the persecution the Muslims faced from the non-believers was at the peak time. That was at the peak time of persecution. They accepted Islam during that time. And many dominant leaders in Quraysh, they were persecuting the believers, the Muslims. At that time, they accepted Islam. So, as an early believer from that Quraysh family and Banu Makhzum tribe, the powerful leaders, they were persecuting them directly, verbally, and physically. They were persecuting both Abu Salma and Salma. So, because of this, they were known for their patience, their resilience during this time, and standing firm on their faith. And during this persecution, when this persecution was increasing day by day, Prophet ﷺ received the revelation for migration, and the first migration which took place was the migration to Abyssinia. First hijrah, we could say, migration to which took place to Abyssinia. It was Ethiopia. Today we call it Ethiopia, that area which is Abyssinia. Umme Salma and Abu Salma, her husband, they were the first one to migrate to Abyssinia because they faced persecution. They migrated in the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this was a blessing for them, a honor for them for migrating to Abyssinia. And this migration was not easy as well. It was a test for them it was a test for them because they have to leave their wealth, their tribe, their home behind for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they lived under the refuge of the Christian leader of Abyssinia, who was known as Najashi. He was a just ruler, so they lived over there for escaping the persecution they faced. Now, this is a little complicated topic, the return from the migration. So after the first migration to Abyssinia, Umm Salma and Abu Salma, after they first migrated to Abyssinia, they returned to Medina and they left in Abyssinia and they returned to Medina. They stayed in Makkah. And then the second migration which took place was the migration to Medina. And during this migration, Hazrat Salma, she faced a lot of hardship during this migration. So this was a tough trial for them. So as they were packing for the migration to Medina, they reached the outskirts of Makkah, because they were leaving from Makkah to Medina. Okay. So they were as they reached the outskirts, Umm Salma had her own clan, Banu Makhzum. They surrounded her in the outskirts. They surrounded her and they snatched her camel, and then they said that they would not let Salma go to Medina. And so her husband, Salma's husband, Abu Salma, he argued with them. But forcibly, Salma had to stay in Makkah because her clan people did not allow. Is my voice clear now?
Ma'am.
If it's clear, we'll continue, okay? Is it clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, where were we? Yes. Salma, she had to stay in Makkah. She could not migrate to Medina because her clan did not allow her to do so. And after this, Abu Salma, he left because he was forcibly said to leave, and Salma stayed. And some men from Banu al Asad, Abd al Asad tribe, they stepped in. This clan, Abu Salma, the husband of Salma, belonged to this clan, and they took Salma's child Salma with them, that they would not leave their grandson or with them. So they took him. So Salma is now separated from her husband as well and from her only son. And after this, Salma was left alone in Makkah, and her husband, who managed to escape Medina, and her son was also taken away from her. And this left her alone and heartbroken. And because of this, she would always go out to a valley, Al Abda, a valley which was called as Al Abda, a valley which was outside Makkah. Sit from the morning to evening, and she would weep and she would cry. And she described this period in her life as the most hardest time in her life. And this lasted over almost a year. Her clan initially refused to let her go to Medina, but after seeing her suffering and crying for such a long time, they allowed her to go. And she started her journey. She took a camel, and her son was also returned to her by her husband's family. Her son was returned to her, so she took her son, she took a camel, and she started to migrate for Medina. But she was left alone during this migration. She was alone with a toddler, with a child with her, and crossing thousands of miles in a desert. Because the distance from Makkah to Medina was a long distance. We couldn't say it was a short distance. It was a very lengthy distance. And that too, it was a desert. And she managed to cover a short distance, but in between, she met Usman ibn Talha, who did not accept Islam. He did not accept Islam that time, but after later onwards, in the future or coming years, he accepted Islam. So He saw Umm Salma's vulnerable condition, her worst condition of carrying a child alone with her and a camel in a barren desert. So he offered to help her, and he led her the camel, and he helped her reach Medina. And Salma later said about Usman bin Talha Alba in this verse that I have never seen an Arab more honorable than him. Who is she referring to? Usman ibn Talha. He never looked at me unless it was necessary, and he never spoke a word to me the entire journey. So she was praising his high character. And then she arrived near Kuba, which was near Medina in the outskirts of Medina. And Abu Salma, seeing Salma, he was overjoyed and he was happy. And he said the following words: We belong to Allah and to Him we return. But by Allah, no one has ever suffered what you have suffered for the sake of Allah. Abu Salma said this to Salma. Okay, so this was her journey. This was her, what can we say, the hardship, the main part of her story, the main hardship which she faced. She was left alone in Makkah. Her husband
Ma'am,
was not
voice
there.
is not audible.
Is it audible now?
Yes, is audible.
Yes. Okay. So she was left alone in Makkah. Her husband uh, was set to go to Medina. Her child was taken from her. So she was left alone nearly a year. And seeing her vulnerable condition, she was crying, weeping every day. Because of this, her relatives allowed her to go to Medina. And that too, she had to carry a small child with her, alone in the barren desert. And she, and with the help of Usman ibn Talha, who was uh, sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, obviously as a help to Musalma, she reached Medina and she reunited with her husband after her successful migration. And next, during 3 after the Battle of Badr, the next year, Battle of Uhud took place. And Battle of Uhud, what happened was that some of the Muslims, disobeyed Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and they moved from the Mount of Uhud. So this Battle of Uhud is a long story, we could say, which I think we actually covered in our last course, which happened about last year. So I won't go into detail. I'll just highlight her story in this. So during this battle, Abu Salma, the husband of Salma, he lost his life. He was martyred during the battle or just after the battle. It is not clear, but because of this battle, he lost his life. He was martyred in this battle. So she was widowed and she had children, several children. So she was widowed and she was left alone with her children. So the inspiring part of this and this background and this part of the story is her response to this martyrdom of her husband was she, rather than turning into despair, rather than complaining that why is it happening to me, even after she faced the hardship of migration and her second migration to Medina, which was obviously a very, you could say, a very hard part of her life, she turned to patience and prayer. She did not complain to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. She did not despair. She, rather than that, she turned to patience, she turned to prayer, and this highlights, and we can say that qualities which she had is defining her whole character throughout her life. And just after the next year, 4 between 625 to 626 CE, Prophet ﷺ married Salma after her period of widowhood. So this marriage was honoring her patience, the way she faced her hardships with patience, and she never lost trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This elevated her status, and because of this, she became one of the Ummahatul Mu'mineen, the mother of believers. This elevated her status. This marriage elevated her status. And a household of learning, we could say. She had a house in Medina, which became a center of knowledge, where people, companions, and late scholars sought her wisdom on matters of faith, law, and family law. People came from far away to learn from her, and her house became the center of knowledge. And her status as the mother of believers was a very respectful position she had in the house because of her spiritual authority within the Muslim community. And next, her contribution, we could say, is the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. So this treaty happened after the battles which took place, the Battle of Badr, the Battle of Uhud, and the Battle of Trench. And after these battles, the Muslims received victory in Battle of Badr. In Battle of Uhud, we could say it was a tie. And in the Battle of Trench, the Muslims again received victory with the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So after this, the Prophet ﷺ had a dream of performing tawaf around the Kaaba. So he said this dream to the companions, and they were overjoyed, and everyone got ready to perform Umrah, and they left for Mecca. So after leaving for Mecca, they came near Mecca, but the Meccans, the Quraysh, they did not allow the Muslims to enter to perform tawaf around the Kaaba. So they camped, the Muslims camped at the area called Hudaybiyah. That's why it is called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The reason it's called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah is because the Muslims camped in an area or a valley, we could say, which was known as Hudaybiyah. So during this time, the Muslims camped outside, and the Quraysh did not allow them to enter and perform tawaf. So the Muslims decided, and the Quraysh and Muslims, they decided that they would make a treaty. And this treaty was, we could say, a kind of unfair treaty for the Muslims if we look into the conditions of the treaty. So the conditions were that the Muslims and the Quraysh wouldn't fight for the next 10 years. And if any person in Makkah accepts Islam and he wants to go to Medina and he goes to Medina without the permission of his or her guardian, he has to be sent back to Makkah, from Medina to Makkah. But if anyone from Medina, from Prophet Prophet's side, wants to come to Makkah, they should be allowed. And the other unfair condition was Muslims should not perform Umrah this year, they should come next year to perform Umrah, and that too only for 3 days. So this, after listening to these conditions, the Muslims were disappointed and they were ready to fight with Prophet ﷺ. He accepted this treaty, and this led to a disappointment or frustration among the companions of Prophet ﷺ. So why are we looking into this treaty right now is Umme Salamah's role in this treaty. So I just gave you a background of this treaty. And during this frustration or disappointment that the companions felt because Prophet ﷺ accepted these unfair conditions, even though the Muslims were in power, they were more powerful than before, they could fight, but Prophet ﷺ accepted these conditions. So after this, Prophet ﷺ said all the Muslims to sacrifice the animals which they bought and shave their heads so that we can return back to Medina to perform the rituals of Umrah. But surprisingly, no one listened to Prophet ﷺ because of their disappointment. So Prophet ﷺ went inside his camp or his tent, we could say, and he said about this condition to Umme Salamah. Umme Salamah was accompanying Prophet ﷺ. So Umme Salamah advised Prophet ﷺ to set the example himself. How? By performing the rituals, the sacrificing of the animal and shaving of the head. Umm Salma said that Prophet ﷺ should perform these acts and the Muslims would follow him. Even though the Muslims were disappointed, Prophet ﷺ went and then he started performing the rituals, and again the Muslims started following him. Even though they were disappointed and frustrated because of this agreement. And while returning to Medina, during this incident, while returning to Medina, Prophet ﷺ received a revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regarding this treaty that this is a clear victory. And this treaty, which seemed unfair for the believers, but listening to Prophet ﷺ, obeying him, made this treaty a clear victory for the Muslims. And we would not look deeper into this topic because this comes under Sira. We're looking into Umm Salma's life. So this highlights Umm Salma's wisdom during this time where Prophet ﷺ were disappointed by the believers because they did not listen to Prophet ﷺ. Salma's advised help the believers to stay on track. The next is her contributions towards Islam. And from being a teacher and a hadith transmitter. So she was the second person from the mothers of the believers to have the highest number of recordings for a hadith. Okay. Firstly, Aisha radiallahu anha is there, who narrated about 2,100 ahadith, and next Umme Salamah comes, who narrated more than 300 ahadith. So these ahadith which she narrated were on the topics, major topics. You could say the four major topics is ritual worship, family law, legal rulings, and private life of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And after this, she spent 60 plus years for teaching. She taught many scholars, many students about these hadiths and the knowledge which she had until her death in Umayyad period. During the Umayyad Caliphate, till that time, she taught many of the believers about Islamic rulings and family laws and ritual worships. And her later life, we could say, she died between 58 AH to 61 AH during the Umayyad Caliphate. Some sources specify it as 59 and 678 CE, and she is reported to be the last surviving wife of Prophet ﷺ. Among the 11 or 12 wives of Prophet ﷺ, she was the last one surviving and living a long life. And during this life, yes, Khatija, are you having any doubt?
Yes, ma'am. AH means?
AH means it was, we could say, during that time, yearly, which we say, no, first year or this year, it
Yes,
was a
ma'am.
ruling at that time. I'll clear it to you. After Hijrah, this said after Hijrah. AH means after Hijrah to Medina. So the battles, we could say, we were saying the battles of Badr, Uhud, and Battle of Trench were in 3, 4, and 2, 3, and 4 AH. So after Hijrah, which means after they returned to Medina, they made a calendar. We could say a
Okay.
calendar type of thing. So it is counted like that. After Hijrah, it means after Hijrah, okay?
Okay.
And where were we? Yes. Her legacy, we could say, is remembered as a migrant. She migrated twice. So this was a honor and this was a blessing for her. This was a test for her, we could say, that she migrated twice, first to Abyssinia and second to Medina, which was, we could say, a very hard time for her. She sacrificed her home and her comfort to faith, to accepting Islam, standing firm on her faith, not losing trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala during this time. She is one of the mother of the believers. Her marriage to Prophet ﷺ elevated her position, and she is a guide for us. She is a role model for the entire Ummah to follow. She
She
becoming
was
a
the
mother and a widow.
Khadijatul Kubra, ma'am.
Yes?
After Khadija Razillah Ta'ala, she was there.
No, no, no. She was there after Zainab bint Khuzaim. She married Prophet ﷺ after the marriage to Zainab bint Khuzaim. Okay? So we're going uh, in order. First, we learned about Hazrat Khatija, then Hazrat Sauda bint Zama, then Hazrat Aisha, then Hazrat Hafsa, then Hazrat Zainab bint Khuzaima, now her. Okay? And she was widowed and she was the mother of Salma. She raised her children with dignity after the martyrdom of Abu Salma, embodying patience and strength. She was a scholar, a teacher, and an advisor. Her wisdom guided companions. She taught many students more than 60 years. And during the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, we saw her wisdom, how she advised Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And her hadith, the contribution which she has in the hadith is also one of the important contributions she made to Islam. So this was her life story, I hope it's clear. Jazakallahu khair.